welcome to the next module here in our course. And in this module, what we're going to be looking at is the issue of money and the economy. Now in this module, we're going to be moving more into one of the areas that we might traditionally think of when we think of Catholic social teaching or social justice. We started off by looking at some more concrete, more sort of small-scale personal issues at looking at the family and work, but thinking about how those interact with society as a whole. But in this module, we're shifting gears a little bit and trying to take a broader look at how we understand money, how we understand the economy in light of Catholic social teaching. And so we're going to be looking at issues like capitalism, the role of government, whether or not our society is too focused on money and the economy, and how we might go about thinking about different ways to live or different ways to govern our society. But before we get to sort of those big issues, big questions, I want to start off yet again by following the lead of the compendium, right? And noting that what we're going to find in the compendium is going to be rooted in Scripture, rooted in tradition, rooted in the Church's understanding of what makes up the human person. Because if you look at the opening pages of this section in the compendium, that's what it's going to start with, is outlining where we can find the basis for the Church's teaching on the economy in Scripture itself, in the life and teaching of Jesus, and also in tradition, the Church Fathers, and the understanding of the person. So again, I know by the end of this course you're going to be tired of this point, but I think it's an essential one because this is not sort of extraneous stuff. This is really at the heart of our faith. And I don't really want to, in this module, reiterate everything we find in the compendium. I really want to focus on some specific challenges and different perspectives raised by other perspectives on money and the economy that we're going to get at here in a little bit. But I do think it's helpful to just note some of the key features that stand out for me from the compendium before we get to some of the other perspectives. And so, for example, if we look in the compendium, we can see really from the outset the basic gist of what the Church is going to say spelled out for us. So, for example, if you look in section 326, in the second part of that, you see the basic summary of what the Church's teaching is, namely, economic activity and material progress must be placed at the service of man and society. If people dedicate themselves to these with faith, hope, and love of Christ's disciples, even the economy and progress can be transformed into places of salvation and sanctification. So I think that's an interesting quotation on several levels, right? So obviously it's going to say something that's been brought up a number of times now and was discussed at some length in our discussion of natural law and other courses, namely that money and the economic life of our country and the world, these are strictly instrumental goods. Over and over again, the Church emphasizes this, right? That pursuit of money as an end or as a goal, or pursuit of profit for a company, or pursuit of gross domestic product for a country, if that's our end, if that's our goal, that's a corruption of the proper way of things. That's a corruption of the way things ought to be. That all of these things on an individual or a corporate or a national level need to be seen and treated as instrumental goods, right? That we make a profit in order to benefit people. We need a productive society in order to benefit its members and other people throughout the world. So the economy and money always have to serve the true good of people and not, of course, the other way around. And I think it's interesting, right, even the way that statement was phrased there, right, that even the economy and progress can be transformed into places of salvation and sanctification, which many of us would see as not the way we typically talk about it, right? That in America we almost equate money and progress with really our ultimate goal. But of course that's not ultimately compatible with the Church's teaching about the goal of life in the human person. As we continue in the compendium, we see something mentioned previously when we were talking about work and other issues, namely that goods, even when legitimately owned, always have a universal destination. Any type of improper accumulation is immoral because it openly contradicts the universal destination assigned to all goods by the Creator. And so we talked about this at the opening of the course, that from a Catholic perspective, there is a right to private property, that private property is part of how God designed human beings to function, but it is always limited, it is always instrumental. And when it begins to work against the goods it's intended for, namely the real integral good of all people, then it becomes illegitimate. And we can see that reiterated here again. And one of the things that stands out for me in particular, as somebody who studies church history and the fathers, is a long section here near the outset of the chapter on money and the economy, where it quotes extensively from the church fathers on their understanding of wealth, their understanding of money. And so I think it's actually worth going over at some length, because I think, because I love the church fathers, and so I get to emphasize that here in my module. But let's just, even if you've read this yourself or going to read this, I think it's worth going over here as well. We look at section 329, we get the summary there. Riches fulfill their function of service to man when they are destined to produce benefits for others and for society. Right, so note here that riches are not aimed primarily at the benefit of the rich person, but they're really intended for the good of others and the good of society as a whole. Quote, "How could we ever do good to our neighbor," asked St. Clement of Alexandria, "if none of us possessed anything?" In the perspective of St. John Chrysostom, riches belong to some people so that they can gain merit by sharing them with others. Wealth is a good that comes from God and is to be used by its owner and made to circulate so that even the needy may enjoy it. Evil is seen in the immoderate attachment to riches and the desire to hoard. St. Basil the Great invites the wealthy to open the doors of their storehouses, and he exhorts them, "A great torrent rushes in thousands of channels through the fertile land. Thus by 1,000 different paths make your riches reach the homes of the poor." Wealth, explains St. Basil, is like water that issues forth from the fountain. The greater the frequency with which it is drawn, the purer it is, while it becomes foul if the fountain remains unused. The rich man, St. Gregory the Great will later say, is only an administrator of what he possesses. Giving what is required to the needy is a task that is to be performed with humility, because the goods do not belong to the one who distributes them. He who retains riches only for himself is not innocent. Giving to those in need means paying a debt. So again, some of these statements really are striking when we look at them from the perspective of 21st century America, right, where we are really indoctrinated, I think you could say, fairly, more or less from birth, that the real goal of our work is to be efficient, to be profitable, and to accumulate the good things that we want. And this is really kind of directly contrary to what we see the Church Fathers saying here, right? They're very clear in the idea that riches are only properly held, if that's the right term, if we're using them for the benefit of others. And St. Gregory the Great's statement there at the end is particularly striking if you look at it, right? It says, "He who retains riches only for himself is not innocent. Giving to those in need means paying a debt." So if when a rich person gives to the poor, it's paying a debt, right? That means, in fact, by extension, that what we would typically call an act of charity is not sort of a voluntary thing we do to earn extra merit. It is, in fact, an obligation. It is a debt that the poor or the other, in a generic sense, is in fact entitled or owed the riches possessed by the rich person or administered by him, to again go back to the language of the fathers. And that's fairly radical stuff if you really think about it, right? Imagine what would happen if somebody stood up in one of the big parishes here in our community and gave a homily to that effect, saying that those of you who have riches beyond what are necessary for your own well-being, you in fact owe that to the poor, right? That you ought to in fact be continually providing for others with your riches. And it's not just something you ought to do if you feel a special call. You in fact owe it to these others. Now again, right, it's important to note that the compendium does affirm a proper good role for private property, a proper role for the free market and capitalism. But before we get to any of that, what we get at the outset here is an explanation from Scripture and tradition that makes some fairly radical claims about the limits of those goods, and that everything is really to be directed towards the good of others, the good of society, and especially the good of the poor, the weak, and the marginalized. Now the compendium goes on to, of course, explain how the market or capitalism, private property, really can exist in partnership with the demands of justice or charity, or generally this sense of responsibility for the poor and for society. But while affirming the legitimacy of all of these things, if they are actually instrumental and not our ultimate goals, again, it is striking when you look at it how in many ways there's at least a tension, if not a conflict, with the way Americans tend to think about these issues, right? That when you think about what the American economic scheme is, right, at least the way I would understand it typically, is the idea of, capitalism is this system that incentivizes productivity, it incentivizes efficiency, right? So the idea is that if we're all working for our own private property, our own profit, our own benefit, that somehow collectively, right, if we're all doing this, in fact, it will be beneficial for everyone, right? So the general idea you hear, right, is that, well, look, when you tell people to work for the good of the whole, people aren't as productive, right? They are often lazy, or they might even just sit back and not do anything and just assume that they're going to be taken care of by others, right? And so that working for others as an explicit goal isn't going to work. So that what we're going to do is instead tell everybody to work for their own benefit, but somehow the net result of that, of everybody doing that, is going to be the general good of society. And again, I'm not an economist, but that seems to be the general message that we get. But we turn around and look at what the compendium has to say and what church teaching has to say. I think it's safe to say that we find something very different, right? It's not saying, well, work for your personal benefit or profit, and the result will be a general good for everyone else as a secondary consequence of that. In fact, it says we ought to aim explicitly at this broader goal, right? The benefiting others and benefiting society. So, for example, if we look at section 333, it says very explicitly, if economic activity is to have a moral character, it must be directed to all men and to all peoples. Everyone has the right to participate in economic life and the duty to contribute, each according to his own capacity, to the progress of his own country and to that of the entire human family. If, to some degree, everyone is responsible for everyone else, then each person also has the duty to commit himself to the economic development of all. This is a duty in solidarity and in justice, but it is also the best way to bring economic progress to all of humanity. So again, it would be, I think, difficult to reconcile that way of thinking about economic life with what is the typical rising tide lifts all boats sort of mentality that we find in the American economy in general, right? That the benefit of others is not sort of a secondary thing that's going to happen as a mysterious net result of everyone pursuing their own personal goals. It is in fact something that we are obligated to explicitly strive for in our work and in the economy. Now I could keep reading individual paragraphs here for quite some time because they are pretty much all of them fairly striking if you just stop and look at them. But I just want to end with one final one because I think it kind of wraps up the introductory part of this section, but also because I think it is sort of uniquely radical, right, in that it's not just critical of the means of producing wealth that we see in society, but in fact it undermines really the ultimate goal. It says that even if we were to succeed at everything we're aiming to do in the way the economy is structured right now, even that would be, I think, problematic. So if you look at section 334, it says, accumulation by itself, even were it for the common good, is not a sufficient condition for bringing about authentic human happiness. In this sense, the Church's social magisterium warns against the treachery hidden within a development that is only quantitative. For the excessive availability of every kind of material goods for the benefit of certain social groups easily makes people slaves of possession and of immediate gratification. This is the so-called civilization of consumption or consumerism. Right? So basically what the compendium is saying here is that even if we were to succeed and achieve a state where we could have basic access to unlimited goods and services at our fingertips, that would not be really a good state of things. In fact, it would be deeply problematic for people because it would tend to encourage an attitude of consumerism or consumption that's in fact spiritually detrimental for people. So not only is there criticism here of the mechanisms that our society uses to sort of drive itself, but there's criticism even of the ultimate goal of a society where we can basically have whatever we want whenever we want it. So I think it's safe to say that in spelling out the sort of foundations of the Church's view in Scripture and in tradition and the understanding of the person, we get a fairly critical perspective on much of the modern economy. Now again, we could continue to work through this section on the economy. We're going to come back to it here in a little bit, but rather than just sort of recap what you can read there for yourself, I thought it would be helpful to bring in some other perspectives to complement the compendium on this discussion of the proper role and understanding of the economy. So the first sort of alternative perspective I really wanted to look at comes from another Christian tradition, namely modern American Protestantism, right? So obviously the Protestant church in America is going to have a lot of similarities with Catholics. We're both drawing on the same scriptures, the example of Jesus, and a fair bit of common tradition, although obviously there's some disagreements on certain aspects of that. But I wanted to take a look at a couple different Protestant critiques of the economy that in many ways mirror what we find in the compendium and Catholic social teaching. For a couple of reasons. One is just to demonstrate that this isn't just a Catholic thing, right? That this is a broadly Christian issue. And also to sort of provide evidence for the fact that the Church's teaching is that Catholic social teaching grows out of natural law and therefore ought to be accessible to anyone who's really looking at the nature of what is good for people. And even more so if those people are also drawing on Scripture, right? So the fact that we can find parallel views, parallel criticisms in the Protestant world, I think is a sort of reaffirmation of what the Church has to say on these issues. But also just again to bring our attention to some dialogue, some controversies going on in other parts of the theological world, so to speak. I think that's a good thing. And frankly, sort of I guess the last reason why I think it's worthwhile bringing up some of these Protestants is that I think many Catholics would admit that our Protestant brothers and sisters are in many cases very good at sharing a message, right? That they're really good in terms of the preaching and the education and the spreading of the faith. And so I think some of these Protestant explanations of the principles we're talking about here have kind of an edge and a catchiness to them that the Catholic Church might find beneficial to make use of. All right, so what specifically am I talking about here in terms of Protestant critiques? Well, obviously, there's a huge range of Protestant views on things, and of course, many conservative Protestants would see this entire discussion as ridiculous, right, and would see no opposition between full-blooded free American enterprise and Christianity. But there are these voices very much like the compendium that we can find in the Protestant world. Right? So perhaps the most notable of these in terms of a criticism of the American economy from a Protestant Christian perspective would be Stanley Hauerwas. Hauerwas is a very prominent theologian at Duke here in the U.S. And he is often cited as the most influential living theologian, or certainly the most influential living American theologian. And he has countless books and articles and things like that. And he has a great deal of influence in Protestant theology. And one of the things he's noted for is his criticism of much of American economic and political life. And so I think we could read for an entire semester and not really cover Hauerwas's critique of the economy. So what I really want to just focus on very specifically is his commentary on the Lord's Prayer. He wrote a commentary on the Gospel of Matthew for a commentary series put out by Brazos Publishers, and his section on the Lord's Prayer, I think, is quite striking. So I'm going to give you a copy of that on Blackboard for you to look at. And there's a number of interesting points in his discussion of the Lord's Prayer, but in particular his discussion of our daily bread and our understanding of material goods as expressed in the Lord's Prayer is, I think, particularly striking. And he uses that prayer and that asking for one's daily bread, of course, and also along with forgiving debts, which he has a fair bit to say about, as a place to talk about the relationship of Christians to riches more generally. And he very specifically targets the common Christian response to this, right, which is to say that, well, it's not wealth that's a problem. It's not a problem if I have a certain amount of wealth beyond what is necessary for meeting my basic needs. Really, the only thing that's problematic is an excessive attachment to wealth, right? And of course, many people point out that that's a very nice way of dodging the issue, but I think Hauerwas puts it very succinctly and powerfully, as he typically does, right? To just quote one small excerpt from that reading I'm going to give you, Hauerwas kind of doesn't mince words at all, and he says, quote, "To be rich and a disciple of Jesus is to have a problem. Christians have often tried to deal with this problem by suggesting it's not that what we possess that is the problem, but our attitude towards what we possess that is the problem. However, Jesus is very clear. Wealth is a problem." And there you have it, right, in very explicit terms. Hauerwas is going to argue, contrary to what many Christians would say, that having an excessive amount of wealth is in fact just by its nature problematic. One might still be able to be a good Christian and avoid sin, but it's going to be a real difficulty. It's in fact going to be sort of a handicap in your spiritual life. And so in fact, following the exhortation of the Church Fathers, what Hauerwas would say is that we ought to divest ourselves of that wealth. Because otherwise it will almost inevitably lead us into sin and away from a proper Christian life. And again, I'll put that reading up and you can take a look at it yourselves and respond to it on the discussion board. But I think Hauerwas puts very powerfully many of the ideas that we would find in the compendium on this point. I would pair him, right, there's another Protestant that stands out in my own admittedly a little sporadic reading in modern American Protestant thought. There's a guy named Brian McLaren who is, again, a fairly prominent theologian, writes quite a few books. He's also very, like Hauerwas, very controversial even in the Protestant world. There are a lot of people who argue that he's a heretic for any number of reasons, but mostly because McLaren really spends a lot of time talking about issues of politics, talking about issues of the economy. And many Protestants, particularly evangelicals, argue against him and say that he's leading people away from the real gospel, and that the real gospel is about sort of the personal debt of sin and guilt, Jesus' atonement on the cross, right? Our acceptance of that atonement by faith, and the aim of eternal life in heaven after death. And McLaren admittedly doesn't spend a lot of time talking about those issues. And in fact, I think it's fair to say that he does err in ultimately minimizing and dismissing those other aspects of our faith beyond concerns with economics and politics. That being said, I think McLaren also is very controversial because he strikes really uncomfortably close to home on many of the issues that he does discuss, right? And he argues, I think, very convincingly that Jesus is not just concerned with another world. He's not just concerned with sort of the guilt of the individual sinner before God and one's eternal fate. And McLaren argues quite persuasively that Jesus, in his life and teaching and work, is very concerned with concrete political and economic issues. And McLaren argues that essentially why so many Protestants are upset at him is that he's undermining and critiquing the nice little system that they've set up for themselves, which he calls theocapitalism, right? And that is that they are really primarily capitalists, and that they modify their Christianity in a way that it doesn't interfere with their capitalist beliefs, right? Because if Christianity just consists of my individual faith in Jesus' sacrifice and going to heaven someday when I die, that leaves me really free to do whatever I want in terms of politics and the economy. And so what he argues is, in fact, that the real principles of theocapitalism, of many Christians who fall into that, are in fact driven by a desire for economic and political power, and not by the gospel in any way. And he puts together, he has a series of different laws of theocapitalism that he describes in his books. So for example, just to briefly kind of summarize them, right, he would say, well, the first is the law of progress through rapid growth, right? And this is the idea that our goal, the way that we are going to improve things is through rapid economic growth, that really ought to be our main focus. And of course, it's hard to dispute that really is the focus of our society. Whenever we get some political or social issue being discussed, the first and ultimate question about it is whether or not it's going to prompt economic growth. This is what our presidential debates boil down to, our congressional debates boil down to. Really pretty much everything is ultimately decided in terms of whether or not we think it's going to promote growth. On a more personal level, he would say we follow the law of serenity through possession and consumption, right? That is, personally, the way we will find our ultimate fulfillment is through possessing and consuming different goods, right? That if we can get X, Y, and Z, then in fact we will have happiness and serenity and peace. And of course, we know that that's ultimately illusory, but it doesn't stop us from having that as our goal nonetheless. He goes on to say that we are also driven by the law of salvation through competition alone, right? And that is the way that we become better people is through competition, right? That the ultimate goal is to succeed in politics or the economy or whatever it might be, and that we have this belief that what is best, what will save us, is what will emerge victorious through unfettered competition. And of course, he argues this is not, in fact, what we find in Scripture or certainly in the Gospel, but that this is how we think of achieving salvation in reality is through competition, particularly in the market. And then finally, the law of freedom to prosper through unaccountable corporations. Now, again, this is maybe a little more disputable than it is a given for most American Christians, but there's certainly something to it, right? That many Christians oppose any attempt to limit economic life or the market because it is seen as the meddling of politics or a liberal agenda or un-American to stifle the free market. And so really that McLaren says that our belief is that if we allow corporations to do whatever they want to prosper, that this is ultimately going to be best for us and best for the economy. But of course, he would certainly dispute that and say that what we find in Scripture is, in fact, repeatedly the idea that if the rich are not held accountable, that they will, in fact, abuse the world, abuse the poor, abuse those around them in their pursuit of profit. And that is, in fact, what we find going on in the world today. Now, Again, I will give you some excerpts from Maclaren so that you can see what he has to say for himself. And I don't necessarily agree with everything Maclaren has to say, certainly not on all issues. So why do I bring this up? Well, I bring them up, again, just as a way of having a slightly different perspective on the issues that the compendium addresses. And also because I think they really do highlight some real problems in our country. I think it really shows that this is a critique of the American economy that is really rooted in Scripture and really rooted in the gospel and Jesus' life and teaching. And this is not just something that comes, for example, from a few European popes, right? And we all know those Europeans aren't really, capitalists the way we Americans are, so maybe we're not so sure about what they have to say about the economy. But here we have another example of certainly American Christians who read the Gospels and I think produce critiques of the American economy that are very much in line with what we find in the compendium. Now, I'm guessing that if you do take some time to look at what Hauerwas and Maclaren have to say, that many of you are going to find it really problematic and probably disagree with it. Now, again, as I said, I don't agree with everything they have to say, but I would point out, right, that if we go a little further in the compendium, that we will find in the teaching of the church much that affirms the basic claims that Hauerwas and Maclaren are making in their critiques. So, for example, if we look at section 349, the church's social doctrine, while recognizing the market as an irreplaceable instrument for regulating the inner workings of the economic system, points out the need for it to be firmly rooted in its ethical objectives, which ensure and at the same time suitably circumscribe the space within which it can operate autonomously. All right, that's a mouthful, a lot of big words there. I think it gets a little clearer as we go along. The idea that the market alone can be entrusted with the task of supplying every category of goods cannot be shared, because such an idea is based on a reductionist vision of the person and society. Right? And basically, if you cut through all of the big words and jargon there, what the compendium is saying is that we can't leave it up to the free market to supply all of our needs, nor can we allow the free market to be not limited by society or by the government in the way that it operates. And again, those are both ideas that would be very controversial for many Christians, both Protestant and Catholic, who would argue that what we need is an absolutely free market. But the compendium, echoing Hauerwas and Maclaren, rejects that idea. And again, if we continue a little further, it gets even a little more pointed, right? Because one of the criticisms that Hauerwas and Maclaren make in their writing is that, in fact, the modern economy, while advocates claim that it's really going to be beneficial for everyone, is in fact producing more and more inequality, right? And that the benefits are disproportionately given to the rich and the powerful. And so they advocate some fairly radical political corrections that would aim to limit those inequalities and in fact redistribute much of the wealth that already exists. Again, proving, I suppose, in one way or another, Mr. Glenn Beck as being correct in some of his assessments. But if we look at the compendium, well, what do we find there, right? If we go to section 362, in analyzing the present context, besides identifying the opportunities now opening up in the era of the global economy, one also comes to see the risks connected with the new dimensions of commercial and financial relations. Right, so with the increasing spread of the free market around the globe, many advocates of unfettered capitalism would say, look, it's all this opportunity for growth. We're going to solve poverty through the free market. And the compendium says, yes, there are some real opportunities, but there are real dangers here as well. In fact, there are indications aplenty that point to a trend of increasing inequalities, both between advanced countries and developing countries, and within industrialized economies. The growing economic wealth made possible by the processes described above is accompanied by an increase in relative poverty. So that, in fact, a rising tide does not lift all boats, and that the benefits of the increasingly complex modern economic system are being really held by a relatively small minority of people. And immediately following, right, that statement, we find in the compendium, again, reaffirmation of Mr. Beck's fears, because in section 363, the compendium says, looking after the common goods means making use of the new opportunities for the redistribution of wealth among the different areas of the planet, to the benefit of the underprivileged that until now have been excluded or cast to the sidelines of social and economic progress. So again, some fairly radical claims here, right, on at least a couple different levels. On the one hand, right, we have here an explicit affirmation of the idea that we need to, in fact, redistribute the wealth as it currently exists in the world, that it is, in fact, far too concentrated in the hands of particular countries, and within those countries, in the hands of a particular minority of individuals. So that's one fairly radical claim, that we ought to be redistributing the wealth that exists in the world. And if you look at this statement closely, right, there's another pretty radical claim here as well, right? Because what we hear from advocates of the unfettered economy is that, well, those people who have the wealth are the ones who have earned it, right? They are the ones who have succeeded in that salvation through unfettered competition that McLaren talks about. And the people who have been left behind, well, they've been left behind because of a lack of industry or a lack of education or something along those lines, right? But if you'll notice what the compendium says is that the poor and the marginalized in the world aren't there because of some defect in their character, but in fact they've been excluded or cast to the sidelines, and that basically the position of the poor is not due to some character flaw on their part, but in fact due to the way that the economy has developed, so that those who initially made the advances into the modern economy have sort of rigged the system in a way that prevents others from entering into it. Again, a fairly radical claim, and certainly contrary to a lot of what you hear in American social discourse, and echoing very much some of the criticisms of Hauerwas and McLaren on those same points. So I would imagine that many of you are still fairly dubious of quite a bit of this, because to be honest, for quite a long time I would be dubious as well, right? And so if you are uncertain of how much credence to give Catholic social teaching on these issues, it may not be a real clincher to find out that some radical Protestant theologians make many of the same criticisms of the modern American economy. So again, not necessarily to prove the point necessarily, but to give another, I think, complementary take on things, I wanted to also take a little time here for you to listen to a noted economist and his son, who is also a noted social scientist himself, talk about similar issues from a purely non-religious perspective. And so what I want to do here is to cut to and give you an interview with this economist, Robert Skidelsky, who authored a book with his son, where he makes many of the same points emphasized in the compendium and in Hauerwas and McLaren, but from a purely economic perspective, or from the perspective of the social sciences, right? And basically, I read their book, How Much Is Enough, and found it not only very persuasive, but also surprisingly in keeping with the church's teaching on these issues. And so I thought it would be a nice alternative perspective to share with you. And again, it's not a terribly long book, but too much to really summarize here. But the basic argument of the book is that given all of the progress we've made in terms of the economy, in terms of producing the basic goods and services we need over the past 100 years, you would think that this would result in a dramatic increase in leisure and a decrease in the amount of time that most people need to spend working day to day, right? But in fact, what they saw is the opposite, right? That people are working longer and longer hours, when at the same time we have a material prosperity really unmatched in human history. And so the book is really looking at the question of why this is, and wouldn't it be better for us to live differently and to give more of our time to leisure and to pursuing other things. And so again, I don't want to talk about it at some length because I want to give you their own perspective on this with this interview. So we're going to take a little time here to hear what these two scholars have to say on these issues from a purely non-religious perspective.
Well, Robert, you came up with the title, didn't you? How Much Is Enough? And then the book kind of sort of grew out of that.
Yes, yeah, that's right. I think there'd been this slump, the 2008 crisis, and I'd been working on Keynes for a long time, and so I thought, well, here we are in another slump. And Keynes had written this essay, Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren, in 1930, which looked beyond the slump, said what are the long-term prospects for our grandchildren. And so I guess I thought, it'd be fun to repeat that exercise, and again in a slump, and then looking forward to what we could expect, especially in view of the fact that some of Keynes's predictions had turned out to be not very accurate. For example, he thought we'd all be working much less now than in fact we are, because we'd be so much richer. So there were things Keynes got wrong. So there was that broader thing of looking at our long-term future, and then trying to work out, to improve on Keynes in a way.
Yes.
But difficult though that is.
But what was really striking about Keynes's essay is that he was right about some things, but very wrong on others. So he was, remarkably spot on incomes, that they have risen pretty much in line with his prediction. But then the problem was, well, why haven't we stopped working to the degree he thought we would?
Yes, and there I think we came up with a number of answers to that. I mean, one of them was he underestimated insatiability. And another was that he didn't really take into account who controlled the work that people did. He just sort of took that as read. And then he also didn't take into account income distribution. These were all averages. It was the whole argument was conducted in terms of averages. And once you break up the averages, then you immediately find out why certain things didn't work out the way he thought they would.
And the other thing, of course, that Keynes inherited, I suppose, from his Cambridge and Eton education was this idea of money as a means to an end.
Yeah.
The end being a civilized and cultured life.
Yeah.
And that was, of course, the ideal of all his Bloomsbury friends. And he assumed that, as people in general got richer, so they'd aspire to this ideal.
Yeah.
But what's happened is that, that ideal of life has pretty much disappeared, leaving nothing, else but, positional competition.
Yes, I mean, people of his class and his circle, they had quite clear ideas of what a good life was. Certainly Bloomsbury did, the Cambridge civilization of his day did, I think the aristocrats did. So there were these ideas of what a good life was, and that but they already had enough in order to live that life. And so the problem, as they saw it, was, well, as societies got richer and richer, wouldn't more and more people have enough? But what they sort of didn't realize is that those ideals they had and those traditions of living they had were not those of the majority.
Yeah.
And so you really got into a situation where people were getting richer and richer, but they really didn't have any particular purposes in life of the kind that Keynes and his circle did.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the goals of our book was to try and revive this idea of economic growth as a process with a purpose.
Yeah.
And to sort of give some content to that.
That's right.
So to come up with a substantive vision of the good life.
Made up of a number of elements.
Yeah, which we sort of identified after reading a lot of previous thinkers from not just from Europe but from all over the world, and we realised there's actually quite a lot of agreement on this.
So it's not just a matter of value conflict.
No.
It's not. It's not just, oh, well, this is your idea of what a good life is, but mine is completely different. In fact, we find out the greatest minds of all times have actually thought much the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, there are differences of emphasis, but pretty much everyone agrees that health, for instance, is crucial to a good life, and that's the least controversial, I suppose, of the basic goods. But also friendship. I mean, relationships of love and trust. Clearly, those are absolutely central. Security.
Security is, again, not so uncontroversial. I think a lot of people would put security pretty high up.
Harmony with nature is a more controversial one, but this is really the idea that you need to, live in some kind of relationship with your sort of natural surroundings. Okay, that doesn't mean that you have to live on the land, but you have to at least be in some sort of touch with nature, and
without worshipping nature.
Yes, I mean it's not a sort of ecocentric view. It's not human beings remain at the centre of the picture. We're just saying part of the good life for man is living in harmony with nature.
Yeah.
So it's not sacrificial like a lot of environmental ethics is.
Yeah, and of course leisure. I mean, leisure is part of the good life. I mean, it's an essential element, and that is where the aristocratic and Bloomsbury ideal comes in very, very strongly.
Yeah.
That's the one I think people find almost hardest to accept, isn't it?
Well, that's because the idea of leisure has become so degraded in our culture. I mean, people think of leisure as simply time off work, time to sort of relax or sort of slob out. And they've forgotten that the word leisure originally had quite a different meaning. It meant activity that wasn't devoted to some external goal, that was an end in itself. But that activity could be very strenuous and demanding and creative.
It could be caring.
Yeah.
There are lots of things. But a lot of people, because they associate leisure with time off work, rather than work as time off leisure, which is our ideal in the end. They think of it as just idleness.
Yeah, and that's why the prospect of endless leisure fills them with dread, or sort of nausea. I mean, they just see a future of watching Big Brother,
doing nothing.
Yeah, but that's of course not what we mean by leisure.
And it's not what need happen, is it? Because that wasn't the way that the leisured classes of old spent their time. I mean, they didn't. I mean, of course, there were lots of them. Some of them did, and you've got to accept that.
Yeah.
I mean, there were lots of dissolute peers and sort of professors who never did any work because they had their colleges were well endowed and things like that. But that wasn't universal rule, was it?
I think you have to have some faith that people will find ways to occupy their leisure time in meaningful activity.
Yeah.
Without the spur of economic need.
Yeah.
If you read the novels of Jane Austen, her gentry folk, they don't have to work, but they occupy their time in organising balls or amateur theatricals or painting, playing the piano.
And there are hobbies of many, many kinds. And the trouble is, trying to get that across. A lot of people say, oh, you're just elitist. I mean, you have a model of life which might fit a few leisured people, cultivated people, but what are the mass of people going to do? Well, they have to be also, education has to change. A lot of these people who did live what we would think of a good life in the past were actually educated to do so, weren't they? Whereas most people today are being trained for jobs.
Yeah, I think, what we want is a more democratized version of what in the past only the aristocracy could enjoy. And that's not elitist. I mean, we're taking our ideals from the elite, but we're, trying to spread them more broadly.
Yeah, I think that's true. And then we have some proposals. We actually, when people ask us, well, how would you bring this about? We do have some ideas, don't we? I mean, I think the idea of a moral a moral basis is there, which is the 7 basic goods. That's the moral foundation. And if people are willing to accept that and act according, certain policies sort of follow from it.
Yes, I mean, I think what we advocate is a mixture of sort of bottom up and top down action. So there has to be some sort of popular groundswell of opinion, but there also has to be some sort of legislation to encourage that.
Well, the popular groundswell might also lead to the demand for legislation. It's not just self-help, although we're very much in favour of self-help and localism of all kinds, people doing their own thing and carving out their own areas of a good life. But we also think there's got to be some political impulse, for example, towards one of our proposals, which is a basic citizen's income. That can only be done by the state.
Yes.
And through the taxation system.
Yes.
A progressive consumption tax to reduce the pressure to consume. And things of that kind.
And the citizen's income, I mean, there's a lot of confusion about this, but basically it would be a sum paid to all adult citizens.
Independent of their position in the labour market.
Yeah, irrespective of whether they're employed or unemployed. And the point would just be to give people more choice as to how much they worked or where they worked. It would give ordinary people the kind of flexibility that in the past only rentiers enjoyed.
And you couldn't start it at its full sort of living income standard. You'd build up to it. But this is a programme which is a 20, 30, 50 year programme. I mean, building up to this idea. You can't say, oh, well, tomorrow everyone's going to stop work and we're going to give everyone a huge income. I mean, it's not going to work like that. It's going to be a transition to a different view of the aims of work and the aims of economic activity.
And the economic sort of fact that underlies all this is that, is mechanization. I mean, machines are gradually making human labour redundant. And what we're saying is that the rational response to that is to try and all shorten our hours of work, rather than insist that everyone work an 8-hour day, which will simply lead to more and more unemployment.
Yeah, or more and more sort of
underemployment.
Underemployment, and underemployment can actually take the form of not working on the job. I mean, there was a huge amount of underemployment in the old Soviet Union. Everyone pretended to work. And what was the phrase? We pretend to work, you pretend to pay us.
Yes.
But of course, a lot of that's happening in our societies. People actually are unemployed on the job, although they're doing the job. I mean, I don't think all of them, but there are some, quite a few. So we don't want that. I mean, we want this to happen openly and in the light of a different appreciation of the value of GDP. GDP as a means, not an end, and so on. So I think what we hope our book will be is a contribution to that rethinking of the ends of economic activity, and in exactly the way that most of the great philosophers and even economists of the time did think of it. It wasn't an end in itself, growth.
Yeah, and the trouble is that the economics profession now has simply shelved morality. It doesn't ask about the ends of life. It treats wants as given, as the slogan goes, and it simply asks about the most efficient means to achieve those ends. So we're really calling for a kind of synthesis of philosophy, economics, and ethics.
And insofar as economics thinks it's got a moral purpose, it's sort of exhausted by the idea of lifting people out of poverty. I mean, I think that if an economist would say, well, what do you think you're doing? What do you think economics is contributing to the well-being of humanity? An economist might say, well, we're suggesting the most efficient means for people to escape from poverty. But then they take GDP as a proxy of that. And what's more, they also have no end point, because you know, poverty is relative. So in a way, where does taking people out of poverty ever end?
Well, the goal of lifting people out of poverty makes sense in poor countries,
Yeah.
where you can sort of shelve the question of ultimate purposes,
Yeah.
because you have a lot of people who are actually starving. But I mean, where people aren't poor in an absolute sense, the question of the ends of life becomes a really pressing one.
It does, but then you can evade it the whole time by inventing relative poverty. People are always going to be poor relative to someone else, unless you have absolute equality of income, which is impossible in any way we don't advocate. So you can't just say, our aim is alleviating poverty. As a moral, that's not a self-sufficient, that's not a sufficient moral principle.
So, again, not all of that is directly relevant to what we're talking about here, but I think a great deal of it is, and I find it to, for at least for me, to be very helpful to see that a lot of what the church says in regard to the limits on economic life, both as part of the focus of our own lives and as part of the focus of our discussion in society, that is affirmed by these non-religious perspectives of the economy or psychology or sociology. And that, in fact, this emphasis on the economy, on ever greater profits, on ever greater gross domestic productivity, these things, in fact, do not lead to better lives, to more happiness. And in fact, we would be better served by different emphasis, by a different focus, by less emphasis on profit and wealth, and more emphasis on doing things that are valuable in and of themselves, like worship, or like developing relationships, or leisure. So I think it's a very powerful affirmation of a lot of the points made in the compendium, that we need to limit the emphasis on profit and wealth, not only because they are contrary to the teaching of Scripture, the teaching of Jesus, although I think those things are true, but even because they will in fact make us happier and more fulfilled people in a purely psychological, economic, sociological sense. So again, I think that's a very interesting kind of synthesis of perspectives there. And so what I want to conclude with then is to, again, we could talk about a whole host of other issues. The compendium talks about the relief of third world debt, or all sorts of other economic considerations that we could consider as policies. But I want to conclude here by just considering the possibility brought up in the interview that we all just watched. And that's this idea of a basic income, right? And again, if you're not familiar with this idea, they explained it a little bit. But the idea is that really what we ought to do as a society is to take our excess productivity, right, and instead of channeling it into ever greater returns on the Dow or what have you, instead we ought to just give everyone a basic guaranteed income, right, that would free people to pursue different goods, right, that people would not be constrained by making a paycheck so that they could have rent and food from week to week, but instead they would be free to pursue the things that they find valuable in and of themselves. Now again, whether or not this is viable, of course this is a noted economist arguing that it is. We can discuss it on the discussion board ourselves, but I would just end by proposing that as a possible consequence of taking the compendium seriously, and taking the perspectives from McLaren and Hauerwas, but also this interview seriously. What would we think of this in terms of a possible answer to the problem of wealth and the focus on money in America? Would it be better to just guarantee everyone an income? And if not, why not, in terms of economic or theological reasoning? And if in fact it would be good, how would the proposal presented here by these social scientists fit with and be supported by the theological ideas we find in the compendium? So this is sort of an experiment on my part. I haven't tried this with a class before, but I'd like to hear, after reading the compendium, after doing the module, what do you think of this as a concrete proposal for a way of enacting the different ideas we find there? So I look forward to hearing your thoughts on that on the discussion board, and I look forward to discussing it with you there.